The other day, Father Bill walked into my office and said, "Hey, Seminarian Seth, would you mind doing a little short video on the Passover and Easter and where those come from?" And I was a little overwhelmed, obviously, because this pretty much touches everything. So I'm going to do my best to go through really briefly about the Passover meal, the Last Supper, and the Mass, right? And how this all is connected and kind of the context of everything. So we're going to start in the present, we're going to work our way back, and then we're going to go back forward. We're going to try and just set some things out there for us to contemplate and meditate on our own, right? Because there's way too much here to be able to talk about everything. All right, so our modern context right here, right now, the Mass. Now, I know we're not able to celebrate the Mass together, but it is okay to continue to cultivate an understanding of the Mass so that we deepen our hunger and we desire it more, because the measure of our desire helps expand our heart. So the next time we encounter the Eucharist and the Mass, the greater the desire, the more God has to fill. He's going to fill it to its brim no matter what. It's just a matter how big our vessel is. All right, so the Mass. The Mass, during the Mass, we are present again at the Passion of Christ and the Resurrection. All right, so those 3 holy days that we're going to celebrate next week: Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, right? The Last Supper, the death on the cross, and the resurrection. Every Mass is a representation of those events. We are mystically and sacramentally present to those events. And so we are reaping. When we receive the Eucharist, we are receiving directly from the Lord the graces of the Paschal mystery, the central mystery of our entire faith. Okay, so that's our present context. Takes us back 2,000 years ago when it actually happened, all right? With Jesus instituting the Eucharist at the Last Supper on Holy Thursday. Now, Holy Thursday, they were doing what? Celebrating the Passover. Very good. All right, the Passover, what does that call to mind? Well, it should call to mind when the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years and the Lord finally called them out and delivered them. The 10 plagues, the last plague, the angel of death came over the city, killed the firstborn, unless they had the blood of the lamb over the doorposts. But the context of this is, again, God calling this people to himself and trying to fix the problem that we created. What is that problem? Sin, right? In sin, this is a brief way to understand sin. Sin, we chose something that was less good in place of something that was more good. The greatest good is the will of God. From the will of God comes all of reality. It is goodness itself. It is the greatest good. In the garden, instead of following the will of God, that greatest good, Adam and Eve chose a lesser good. They chose to try and satisfy themselves instead of listening to God and following his will. What that did, it broke the whole system. It flipped it on its head. Everything became disordered. Our intellects became darkened, our wills became weakened, and our passions became directive. All right? And so the plan of God is to reorder us back. All right, now, we were broken from the inside out. Okay, and there's this thing called freedom. So God can't just go in and work things around and fix it from the outside. He's going to have to fix it from the inside out. All right, so we see this kind of strange thing start to develop immediately. Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel, it begins when they make an offering to God, a sacrifice. So this whole idea of sacrifice, very deep, very profound. We can spend a lot of time thinking and contemplating about it. But basically, it's a form of communication. When in the Old Testament, especially, a sacrifice was saying God is more important than. It was a form of communication. So they would take the first fruits of the harvest, if you will, and they would burn them. God is more important than these. It is a way of working from the inside and trying to reorder ourselves to the greatest good. So we sacrifice something that is good, our harvest, in order to realign what we desire to be the greatest good. God is more good than these things. And right from the beginning, this is already getting messed up, right? Because what is Cain's problem? He doesn't offer the best, right? So he is already holding back, okay? So this idea of sacrifice kind of culminates with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is asked to sacrifice his only son. His only son? Dang, that is a pretty amazing thing. It is a very high good. And so Abraham is asked to sacrifice him to remember, to call to mind, that even his son is less important than the will of God. Now, an important thing to remember in the Abraham and Isaac story, Abraham doesn't kill Isaac. He was just asked to. Okay, and that might be splitting hairs, but anyway, there is ways of understanding this that is not a manipulative, wrathful God that asks to do crazy things. He stops Abraham from doing it. But what it shows us is it shows us the disposition of the one doing the sacrifice. The disposition of the one doing sacrifice is that God comes first. Okay, so that's the kind of the culmination of it. Now that story is really amazing. Go back and read it. It's in Genesis. Because before they go up the mountain, Isaac asks Abraham, where's the sacrifice? Abraham says, God will provide himself a lamb for the sacrifice. God will provide himself a lamb for the sacrifice. And then when the angel of the Lord stops Abraham from killing his son, and they look into the thicket, what do they find? A ram, not a lamb. From that moment forward, we are waiting for the lamb to be sacrificed. Flash forward. The Israelite people are in Egypt in slavery for 400 years, and the Passover. The Passover, the 10th plague that God is delivering upon Egypt so that he can bring his people out of Egypt into freedom. How are the Israelite people saved? With the blood of a lamb over the doorposts. Okay, this is changed. This is different than the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac, because now the sacrifice is vicarious. They are saved by the death of a lamb, right? So now there's two concepts we have. One is that of Abraham and Isaac. The disposition of the one doing the sacrifice is a completely ordered will. Abraham desires the will of God more than even the life of his own son. And then the second piece we get from the Passover is that the sacrifice can be vicarious, which means that another can be a means of sacrifice for us. With the effects of that sacrifice can be applied to us. Okay, so that sets us up for the Last Supper. The Last Supper in the New Testament, Jesus is in Jerusalem because of the Passover. He's there to celebrate the Passover with his disciples. And in the Last Supper, he takes the bread, breaks it, gives it to his disciples, and says, "This is my body, which will be given up for you." Jesus becomes both the sacrificer, the one whose will is perfectly ordered to God, who puts God first, and the sacrifice, the perfect, unblemished victim that is vicariously sacrificed for us. That sacrifice is applied to us, right? And there's so many more parallels that have so much fruit to bear. Read that story of the institution of Passover in the Exodus, when because there's the lamb, and then they consume the lamb, right? Part of the Passover meal is to eat the lamb, and then there's the unleavened bread, and there's so many symbols that tie together what we do now with the Last Supper of Jesus and the Passover of the Jewish people. It's all in this incredible context, this incredible narrative, and it roots us in these fundamental core realities of what God is doing for us. He is offering himself as the perfect gift, the perfect unblemished sacrifice to reorder ourselves, to reorder us from within, because he became man, to reorder our wills, to love God first, put God above all things. That's a lot. I'm sorry. This was my task. I hope that you can pray with some of this, that you can engage some of this, and prepare ourselves when we reconvene together at the Lord's table, and just remember the gift that the Eucharist really is. Keep praying for us. We'll keep praying for you. Let's all pray for each other.